Hello, my name is Ian Hodgins and I work as a GP, but I'm also a trustee of the magnificent Ford Park Cemetery in Plymouth. I'm fascinated with local history, and I want to tell you about a wonderful Victorian lady that I came across in my research. Her name is Louisa Weeks, and I'm particularly fond of her for a number of reasons. Firstly, because she was the first person that I came across in my research who actually showed a personality. And secondly, her life reveals the difficulty that many young women had in Victorian Plymouth. Now I want to read the newspaper write-up of court reports from January 1851, and they begin, "A true bill having been returned against Louisa Weeks, 22, she was placed in the dock charged with stealing on the 28th of November 1850 one sheet and other articles the property of Thomas Elliot. The prosecutor is the keeper of a house of ill fame in Higher Lane, his wife, an aged woman, actually being the principal witness. She was actually 52. The prisoner rented one of the rooms for some months, but left without giving notice on the 7th of December, which the wife of the prosecutor stated was the last time she saw the prisoner in her jurisdiction." I think that's very, very sinister. 2 days afterwards, finding the prisoner did not return, her room was entered, and it was then discovered that 2 bolsters, a pillow, a pair of sheets, and 3 blankets were missing. Information was given to the police, and Weeks was apprehended at a beer shop. The property, which was clearly identified, was pledged by the prisoner in her own name at the offices of at the pawn office of Mrs. Levi of Southside Street. Weeks, being called on for her defence, said, "It's almost impossible, sewing is so much alike. Anyone could say that this was their work, as Mrs. Elliot had done." But she added that the prosecutor kept a very bad house, there being not less than 5 prostitutes living there, and this is the house. We found it on the map from the censuses. 1851 is the census year, and shortly afterwards this is the house which is next to Mrs. Elliot's, and it's obviously the house which was used. So this is the house, and the nuisance consequent upon her keeping 11 pigs in the same house. And here's the backyard of the house, and the pigs are shown. Look, I've shown them. They're to scale, and look, there's one on the toilet there. But anyway, back to the story. The nuisance of keeping the pigs was so great that one could hardly live on the premises. She bestowed more care upon them pigs than she did upon the unfortunate girls, who, so long as they brought money into her, they were the best in the world. But if they had no money, they were kept without food and forcibly turned out into the streets." Whilst this statement was being made, and this is the newspaper carrying on, and it's absolutely fabulous coverage. Whilst this statement was being made, Mrs. Elliot appeared to be transfixed with horror at the imputation cast upon her fair frame. She rolled her eyes, she shook her head, she lifted up her hands in apparent expression of virtuous indignation. This is straight from the newspaper, absolutely brilliant. But Inspector Damrell, the police officer, having been called to testify, said that he knew the character of the prosecutor's house, and that actually it couldn't be any worse than it actually was. And so therefore, the verdict, and all these Victorian trials are very, very short, and that was probably all the evidence that was given. So the jury was sent off and had to create a verdict. The recorder having left the case with the jury, they consulted together for some time. At length, they came back to the court with an appeal stating that they weren't satisfied with the woman Elliot. And you can sense the annoyance of the judge here in the next statement was shouted back at them. Do they believe a crime had been committed? If so, was it brought home to the prisoner? In other words, Louise Weeks had actually confused the jury into thinking that she wasn't on trial. Fantastic, brilliant lady. Okay, but a verdict of guilty was forthwith returned, the recorder observing that no jury, having had proper regard for their oaths, would have returned any other verdict. And the judge's annoyance continued. With respect to that woman Elliot, it was clear from the inquiries which had been made that the description of the house which she had kept was a great scandal to the town. and a great disgrace to herself, and all such nuisances ought to be abated. Louisa Weeks was sentenced on the following day to 1 month's imprisonment, which she served. And looking at sources, we can scrape together some other details of her life. She was born in Devonport in 1828. She was married in 1845, aged 16, to a sailor, but obviously the sailor left because there's no other signs of him in any more records. But there's another criminal trial for her from 1848, and here it is. Here's a write-up. We've got it here. Louisa Ann Weeks, 19, was indicted for stealing 2 £5 notes and 3 sovereigns from the person of Richard Kennedy on the 11th of February. And Mary Ann Knight and Francis Rich, 28, were charged with receiving the same, knowing them to be stolen. The prosecutor was a sailor, and for a sailor, £13 is about 4 to 5 months' wages. And having paid for the night in the company of Weeks at a house of ill fame in Castle Street, discovered on the morning that he'd been robbed of all of his money, and this is very, very common, so every 2 or 3 weeks you see this happening. It was clear that Candy had been robbed and that the prisoners were more or less implicated in the transaction, but the evidence was so contradictory and so hard to distinguish who was the principal stealer and who was the receivers that the result was that they were all acquitted, the recorder having remarked on their narrow escape which they had had. The learned gentleman also expressed himself in strongest terms as the character of the house in question. And see, here we go on again about the character of the house and what's going on in the house, and the circumstances under which the prosecutor lost his money as being the highest degree discreditable. As a side note, this is very common. Sailors come ashore with lots of money, get very drunk, sleep with a prostitute, wakes up, all the money is gone. Most of the trials don't get a conviction, and the sailor doesn't get his money back, and that money enters the Plymouth economy. The final record which shows Louisa Weeks was her death. She died in Plymouth Workhouse in December the 26th on 1855, aged 26 years. She was buried in a pauper's grave in Ford Park Cemetery, Plymouth. And over the years, 32 other people have been buried in exactly that plot. Now, not all prostitutes had this tragic young death. I'd like to move on to Mary Ann Kite. She was the receiver, or maybe wasn't the receiver, of the stolen goods in the very last story. Here's the census from 1851, and by then she'd moved from Plymouth to Croydon. But she's no longer a prostitute, but a nurse and a lady's maid in the church, for the children of the principal curate of Shirley and vicar of Addington. And we can follow her through the censuses. Every 10 years she appears, up until 1891, when at the age of 71 she's no longer maid to the couple who redeemed her, and that's a very Victorian phrase. This lady had been one of the redeemed, but she's a lady maid to one of their children, one of the children that she helped bring up. And we know from the death records that she lived on to the age of 78. Absolutely fascinating. Thank you for listening.